variety of career and academic programs. We are moving towards the career technical education field.
So there's a lot of opportunities in career programs in a field where they get certifiable skills.
Students can save time and money while earning a bachelor's degree right here at the University Center.
We're here to walk students every step of the way, from applications to scholarships to course selection.
And then go further beyond that and take master level classes.
It's a brand new Wayne County Community College district.
We're here to stay.
Watch WHPR and TV 33 when you want, where you want, how you want. WHPR is now in your pocket. Download our free app by going to the App Store or Google Play and enter WHPR TV in the search engine. And there we are. You can download WHPR TV or radio. You heard about it. Now come be a part of it. Roku Detroit Worldwide. Approximately 8 million viewers. You're watching W33BY, Detroit, Highland Park, Michigan. The views and opinions expressed on the following show are not necessarily the views and opinions of W33BY, its affiliates, management, or sponsors.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to a Rainey Law Power Hour. Today we're very fortunate to have attorney Carmen Peterson with us today, and her background is very, very interesting. She's a graduate of the Wayne State University School of Law. She specializes in juvenile-related matters. She's a juvenile advocate. Welcome aboard. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. I certainly appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to have to speak a little louder, both of us today.
Oh, got it.
Okay. Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about your background? I read your bio, and I understand that you grew up in Detroit and attended Wayne State University. Is that correct?
I absolutely did. I was born and raised in Detroit on the east side. I went to Kettering. I graduated from Kettering, and then from there went to Eastern Michigan University, and they had at the time what was a new paralegal program. I wasn't very interested in political science, but I knew I wanted to be an attorney, and so I went into their paralegal program, graduated from there in 2004, and from there I went to Wayne State Law and graduated in 2010.
And then after graduating in Wayne State, I understand you were in Illinois for a while, working in the juvenile justice system, and you decided to come back home.
I did. I loved my work there, I must say that. But Detroit has always been where my heart was, always. And growing up in Detroit, I thought it was very important to come back and practice in the city where I grew up, in the community, serving the people who grew up right alongside me. And so I thought that was very important, and that's how I ended up back in Detroit.
Now, since you're in the juvenile justice system, and a lot of our audience out there are parents and grandparents, could you give them your telephone number and how they can reach you if they have questions about the rights of juveniles who've been arrested and what their needs are?
Oh, absolutely. I can be reached at area code 313-218-4465. I'm right down in the Greektown area, right across from Greektown Casino. I know everybody knows where that is. And the name of the firm is CM Peterson Law. And I'm at 400 Monroe, Suite 290.
Now, you and I were talking off the air as to how difficult it is to represent juveniles. And I want you to share with our audience some of the problems that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis in representing juveniles.
Well, I think with juveniles, I think you have to, it's a very complicated system. And you are dealing with juveniles who sometimes they may commit adult crimes, but they are still juveniles. Their mind is not completely for lack of better words, is not completely evolved. It's not an adult mindset, but they certainly get themselves into trouble with respect to a lot of things that have to do with adult-like offenses. And so there's a very fine line there of certainly trying to be sure that you are advocating for them and protecting their rights, but also trying to some degree do what's in their best interest so they don't end up in that situation again.
Would you agree with me that one of the most difficult parts of advocating on behalf of juveniles is building a trust with them?
Absolutely, absolutely, because I think that in a juvenile world, I think adults just in general are, sometimes kind of scary for juveniles. They may not admit that. But I think building that relationship and having them be able to talk to you honestly and freely so that you can, properly protect them and protect their rights is one that's difficult, but it's essential to an effective defense.
Now, when parents call you about their children get suspended from school because they get into a fight. That is an offense that would require you, if they retain you, to represent these individuals in juvenile court, correct?
That's correct.
Are there deferral programs?
It depends. They have a lot of different programs in the juvenile system, which is awesome for juveniles. Something called the Right Track program, where for sometimes first offenders are able to get into this program, where essentially if they follow, probation or different terms and conditions placed on them by the judge, that they are never actually convicted of the actual crime. And so, with that being said, it gives them somewhat a second chance to avoid the stigma of having a conviction and trying to move forward and be better, opposed to just convicting them and having that be on their record.
That raises an interesting question. If a juvenile has a conviction, do they have to wait until they're an adult to get the record expunged?
No. That's not my understanding of it. But with that being said, when you start to kind of rack up those convictions, it gets that much harder to try to get your record expunged as you move on. And so you really try to avoid that with the different programs that they have that the prosecutors offer. A lot of times you want to try to really take advantage of those to be sure that you don't continue to get into trouble. Because it's like sometimes after the first time, it's that much easier to pick up even more convictions. And for some kids, that all they need is the one time. But for some kids, it takes a little bit longer for them to learn.
But if they don't learn and they have repetitive experiences and encounters with the law where they have multiple convictions, all of that is exposed to the judge who sentences them as an adult. Isn't that true?
That's absolutely true. Many people have the mistaken belief that just because you commit crimes as a juvenile, that once you're an adult, those things are sealed, or that you're no longer able to see them, or that the judge can't see them. And that's absolutely not true. Unless that offense is expunged, it is there.
Now, in your advocacy on behalf of juveniles, do you look at the big picture? When I mean the big picture, it's not just the crime, but do you look at the family? Do you look at the environment? What's your goal? What do you want to accomplish for that young individual who's being charged with a crime?
You absolutely do. You look at the totality of the circumstances, and I think most times what I've seen is that children that end up in the system, they certainly have come from broken backgrounds, single-parent homes, where they're being raised by their grandmother because their parents are for lack of better words, MIA. And so I think you have to look at those experiences to know how to move forward. I think you certainly talk with the judges and the prosecutors about those different situations that they may have ended up in and their background, because a lot of times those can be used as mitigating circumstances when it comes to sentencing or different plea deals. But I think you absolutely have to pay attention to those things that may be in their background to know exactly where to go and what type of programs to try to get them into to hopefully stop them from becoming a repeat offender.
How do you handle a situation where a juvenile commits the same type of crime that an adult would commit? For example, an armed robbery. 15-year-old decides to hold up someone in a gas station.
The thing is, once again, I think one of the biggest distinctions between the juvenile system and the criminal system is just the mindset, because more times than not, you get juveniles, they do things, they're not thinking about the consequences, they're not thinking about the severity of their actions. Whereas adults, it's safe to say most of them have been around the block a couple of times. They certainly know better, and that's not to give an excuse to juveniles, but I think that there has to be a level of compassion and understanding there in order to get these kids back on the right track. They obviously have fallen off the wagon somewhere along the way, and so I think that while you certainly have to pay attention to the gravity of the charges, especially something like an armed robbery, but I think you also have to look at the child, the background, and those type of things, and take that into consideration when defending juveniles.
When you're defending juveniles, do you think it's important to have psychological evaluation to determine what's motivating the individual to get into trouble?
I think that comes into play sometimes, because I think that gives a backdrop to a lot of the issues that we can't see on the surface. So I think that is certainly an option or a route that you can take, because I think it will certainly show things that you wouldn't have otherwise known, and the judge and the prosecutor either. I mean, they're at some point, children start to, some of the crimes start to look the same. And I think the way that you distinguish them by, someone who may end up being a repeat offender is just looking at those little nuances, like a psychological evaluation and certain things like that may be telling a different story about how to actually help this kid.
And how do you feel about the juvenile detention system? Do you think it really serves a purpose in detaining juveniles with other juveniles? I mean, I have my opinion about it, but I want to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, I think that I think what you have is you run up against a situation where you have some juveniles who, although obviously they're juveniles and they're minors, they can be very dangerous. And so I think sometimes to protect the public, you certainly have to have these types of systems in place. The problem is there are also other kids mixed up in there, first-time non-violent juveniles who certainly need more of a structure towards rehabilitation other than just detaining them, trying to protect the public. You have to have something in place that will educate these children so that they don't go back to the same thing. And so sometimes just throwing them in the juvenile detention center doesn't serve that purpose very well.
Let's take a call here. Good afternoon.
Hello?
Hi, how are you?
Oh, I can barely hear you. My name is Miss Sullivan. I'm calling. I have a question. Okay, I agree with a lot of things you're saying, but in the case of like Nathaniel, I believe it was Abraham, okay, it may have started at home, but the system had him for almost 10 years, and he came out and was, how would you define his situation?
Well, the Nathaniel Abraham situation, when he came out and he got into trouble again, it's one of the problems with the juvenile detention system. I'm
sorry, I can barely hear you. I'm going to have to hang up and listen.
One of the problems with the juvenile detention system is that when individuals are detained and placed in the system, they're exposed to other individuals with, unfortunately, similar mindsets,
Absolutely.
Similar backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And they cleave to each other, and it's like they boast about their skill sets and what they can do. And unfortunately, many juveniles come out of detention with a new skill set to commit new crimes.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And that may have been one of the issues with Nathaniel Abraham. And that was what I wanted to ask you about. How do you really feel about detention?
Unfortunately, I don't think that it does. I don't think it serves our children the way that we need it to. Because just as you said, some of them come out better criminals than they went in, which is really unfortunate because it does sometimes it doesn't do anything to rehabilitate them, and that is what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be more than just consequences for whatever actions or whatever crime that you've committed at the time. It's supposed to be geared a lot more toward rehabilitating you so that when you do get out that you're able to be reintegrated into society and not allow this this mistake that you've made to ruin the rest of your life. However, if your experience is to get better at what you went in for and pick up some other skills on in some other areas, when you get out, I mean, it almost sets you up for failure. At least in my opinion. And there have been some kids who are scared straight, and one time is enough, and they don't go back. But for the other ones that are, that may need a little more help, juvenile detention doesn't seem to help them very much.
We're going to take a break, and I invite you to call in when you come back because this is really a unique opportunity. Carmen has had experience in 3 different facets, 3 different areas dealing with children: family placement, juvenile delinquency, working for the defender's office, and also in private practice. So she knows many different aspects of it and understands them. So if you have questions, we invite you to call in with them. Get back with us in a minute. Thank you.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. Know your rights. Watch Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law, Tuesdays at 5 p.m. here on WHPR, Detroit Live.
You know, one of the things that I talked to you about earlier was that the juvenile detention system affords individuals who really don't have a family unit a place to have a family unit. Would you agree with me?
Yes, absolutely.
So that when individuals are incarcerated, they bond with each other because they don't have a family unit.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that becomes dangerous to some extent because, like you mentioned earlier, with the issue of, learning different skills and being a better criminal coming out than you were going in. I think that when you have that kind of situation, you kind of setting them up to fail.
And would you agree with me that we would be further ahead instead of using detention and come up with some type of deployment program where there would be an alternative so that they juveniles could get educated, they could get rehabilitated, they could get retrained, and when they came out from the system, they would have completed high school, they would have certification, they would have a skill set, they could go out and get a job.
Absolutely. I think for years, people have been trying to come up with a better way. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet. But I think that is paramount to reintegrating these children back into society, especially the ones who spend a substantial amount of time there. Not only do these people become their family, but they don't know how to. Sometimes they don't know how to operate on the outside, and that sounds crazy. Um, but that's absolutely what happens. And so to try to get out and try to figure out how to navigate when you have been locked in detention for years on top of years, sometimes that can be very, very difficult. And if you don't have the right support system coming back out, which, many of them don't because they probably wouldn't have ended up there had they had that support system, it's very difficult to try to figure out where do I go from here as a juvenile.
Now, I know that you're currently representing some young individuals who are charged with armed robbery.
Yes.
We can't identify them, but you certainly have had the opportunity to interview. I know there are professional limits on what you can share with us,
Hmm.
but weren't you curious as to what motivated them to commit?
I think that, you know, by and large, a lot of them come from the single parent homes that we kind of talked about earlier, and that was no different here. The father died several years before. A mom who was working very hard to try to sustain her household with a couple other children as well as the minor that was in trouble. And, it just seemed like, unfortunately, because of all of the different things that she was trying to do with regards to sustaining her family, there may have been a lack of supervision of keeping them busy enough so that they don't end up in these types of things. And then the other thing always too is, there's incredible pressure on our juveniles and our young children to have the best clothes, the Jordans, all the name brand clothes. And when
the station here. Can you hear us now?
We can't hear anything.
Oh no.
How about now?
Let's see.
Miss Sullivan?
Nope. Okay, now, yes.
Well, we appreciate you calling and helping us. Thank
Okay,
you.
yes, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
Good show. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to get back to that question because our technical staff over here apparently got caught up in some other area and dropped the ball with us for a minute. But let's get back to our question. I was talking about the status problem with young criminals because they want to emulate other individuals in society, whether it's a TV personality, a rock star, a baseball player. They want the sunglasses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And self-esteem, we talked about. Is that a big issue?
I think it's a huge issue. I think that, especially when you're talking about high school, now even middle school, you are, a lot of times just being in school, you need the freshest kicks. You need the best hair and nails and, outfits. And, when you're looking at the family structure that some of these kids are coming from, it's very difficult for them to maintain that. And it makes them feel like they can, like they're valuable or that to some degree that they, that they belong. They're the cool kids. They're what from home. Sometimes they will take another route, which is usually criminality, and that's how they end up in some of these situations.
Let's take a call.
What to do with young individuals who come out of the prison systems or in situations, how we can keep them occupied before they get in. But it seems to me that there is certainly a disproportionate number of poor youth or youth of color in the prison systems now as compared to people who are maybe middle upper class. And perhaps part of that is because of the representation these individuals get when they're assigned counsel by the court. I know a lot of consuls overworked when they're assigned to represent these individuals. As members of the bar, can you think of any ways or perhaps something that could be done, a solution, so that these kids start getting fair representation and instead of just taking a plea and having it on their records from the time they're 18 on, perhaps there could be something that could stop it at that point instead of just, okay, go get tagged, come out, and now have a menial job and hope you don't get in trouble again. And if maybe you could address that facet of it, and I would like to listen offline if I could.
Thank you. Please.
Well, I think that it's to point to representation as being a big part of the problem of how a lot end up incarcerated. But I think there's a bigger issue. I think that when you really look at some of these things, it does some of it certainly comes down to counsel. But I think here in Detroit, there is a assigned counsel and there's not a public defender's office. So you don't have one or two public defenders, who probably are overworked and underpaid. You have a system of very qualified attorneys who are assigned on a rotating basis these cases. And I think what happens, I think the reason that is done that way to some extent is so that you don't have one or two people being overworked and cases falling through the cracks and children getting less than zealous advocacy as they deserve. So I think that obviously in any system you're going to have bad apples or attorneys that are not their best, but I think we have a very good system here. But I think a big part of it too comes from when we talk about the policing of some of these juveniles, because I think when you're looking at if you're talking about in terms of class and race as the caller talked about, I think sometimes in the inner city, kids, unfortunately, opposed to being taken home to their parents when they get caught doing something that's not an armed robbery, obviously, but something that doesn't necessarily require intervention from the courts. They're not taken home to their parents, knocked on the door, and then the cop tells the parents what's going on, and the kid goes in the house, and all is said and done. A lot of times, these kids are taken into the system, and once you get into the system, it's that much harder to get out. And I think sometimes what I've seen is that some of the other upper class juveniles, and they end up with a slap on the wrist from the cop that night, and the cop takes them home to the door, and they never end up in the system. So I think that has something to do with the amount of cases that come in. But I think the other thing that you're looking at is a lack of resources in the inner city, where these underprivileged kids are growing up, and so you can't catch it on the front end. Try to be proactive and set up different programs and different. I mean, there was a time where there was a youth center almost in every neighborhood where you could go after school and play basketball or cheerlead or whatever the case may have been, something that kept you off the streets. But if you look at a place, the case, and so these kids don't have any. And so I think that's how a lot of times how you end up with them being in the system in the first place. And then obviously, absolutely, when you look at representation, sometimes it's not up to par in certain situations. Whereas if you have retained counsel, a lot of times, the motivation obviously is a little different to advocate in that particular case.
Well, the issue is vigorous advocacy, regardless of whether it's appointed or retained.
Absolutely.
And quite often in the system, because they have this rotation in the juvenile court and in the criminal system over in the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, a lot of people are getting inadequate representation because they're being forced to plead.
I can agree. I certainly can agree that there are some deficiencies there. Absolutely. And I think that unfortunately, some kids do end up caught up in that triangle of the assigned counsel, or having 2 or 3 attorneys within a single case, and everybody not necessarily being up to speed. And when you have retained counsel, there's certainly something to be said about that. The motivation is a little different. You're being paid most times a very good fee to defend the case, and so your motivation is different, and I think that there are different outcomes as a result. I'm not sure what you do to kind of remedy that issue, because I know that the court offers training, and maybe they could offer more training, or maybe there should be an evaluation system at the end of the year regarding certain attorneys in certain cases, or somebody that oversees what happens, not just assigning the case pleads out, and that's the end of it.
I might handle 6 or 8 criminal cases a year. When I come down, I see a lot of brothers and sisters in the bar, fellow attorneys that I've known who had private practices now taking assigned cases. And it's offensive to me because I know that they're not trying the cases. There isn't vigorous advocacy, and that's what I think our caller was talking about. Defending the rights of individuals is our responsibility. Would you agree with me?
Absolutely.
And plea bargaining is an important part of that if it's necessary.
Right.
But if it's not necessary and there's deal making for deferrals, why should we be pleading young people and having an arrest record turn into a criminal record?
We absolutely should not. I mean, obviously, when you take a plea deal, everything should be explored, all options. I mean, that certainly should be something that should be up to the juvenile with the right advice of counsel, because obviously it's their right. You can't take that away from them, and some of them, but you have to be sure that they are making an informed decision. And so I absolutely think that plea bargaining is an important part of this. But as far as I personally think that a lot of times the juveniles will be well served with more programs that allow them the opportunity to be more educated, to actually show the judge that they can, in fact, reintegrate, and that they're not the danger to society that they appear on paper to be, but that they can they certainly can be rehabilitated given the right circumstances. And I think that those opportunities do exist, but I think that we as attorneys need to be more creative with some of the offerings when it comes to those certain situations, because looking at the backgrounds of many of these juveniles, they don't have anywhere to go. They don't have the guidance when they leave the courthouse. And even if you're on probation, you cannot be with these juveniles 24 hours a day. So I think that there needs to be some more creative and innovative programs to keep them out of the system.
We're going to take a break for a minute. We'll be back. We invite calls.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. Know your rights. Watch Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law, Tuesdays at 5 p.m. here on WHPR, Detroit Live. About representation. I'm a juvenile and I'm arrested. And I'm arrested again and I'm arrested again, but I've never. And they're going to set a bond for me. So the prosecutor and the court have an opportunity to look at my prior record because it's all there.
Absolutely.
So, okay, so it's all there, right?
It's all there.
And when it's all there, do you think it's fair that my arrest record, without any convictions, should become part of the decision making for the judge when I haven't been convicted of a crime?
Absolutely not. And the reason is, let's just say you are arrested for first-degree murder, never convicted, the case is dismissed, what have you. Moving forward, that's something that is always going to be a stigma. I mean, just the severity alone, when people see that, they have questions about it. And the fact that it stays there, there are, when certain companies, when they run background checks for employment, it comes up. And a lot of times they have questions about that. And they may pass over your application just because they see that. And that's wholly unfair. Because if you were never convicted of it, I think any record or any link to it should be destroyed so that you are not prejudiced by that arrest, because anybody can be arrested for anything. And if there's no follow through and there's no conviction, well, there obviously then, any mention of it should certainly be destroyed. It shouldn't be there on display for people to see and draw their own conclusions about what actually happened.
So what do you think we should do as lawyers to advocate for change in this area?
That's an awesome question, and I don't know that I know the answer to it, but I think that it starts a lot of times with our lawmakers, our local lawmakers. I mean, there a lot of times things don't change because nobody says anything about them, or the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. I mean, a lot of times when you voice your opinion and you don't let up, somebody has to listen, and eventually a lot of times someone will. But I think there has to be that outrage about that. And I think in the grand scheme of things, people are not as outraged about it. And so the people are not really taking notice of it. But I think that it has to be something that people voice. You have to be boisterous about these things. If you don't, they'll never change. A lot of times people don't just wake up and decide, well, I think we're going to change this law and we're going to get rid of those arrest records if there's no conviction that stems from it. Unless you have, a lot of times, a person that's in that particular situation that works to, get it in front of the people that it needs to be.
Now, let's assume you're representing a juvenile who's been convicted, and that juvenile wants to re-enter school. And the school says, well, we've got a convicted juvenile offender.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that individual should be precluded from re-entering school?
Absolutely not. And here's why. Essentially, if you want our children to do better and be better, you cannot shun them after they've made a mistake, because some of them truly make mistakes and they are able to at some point rehabilitate themselves and move forward. But you can't expect that to happen if every time there's a mistake or there's a conviction that you automatically throw that kid away. They don't deserve that. They don't deserve that. People are human. They make mistakes, and especially juveniles, because their brains aren't fully formed. They don't have the thought processes of adults, and you have to take that into account. I think I think more so now, maybe, kids are in tight situations where they're being convicted and they're being charged as adults, and all sorts of different things are going on. And I think we need to be a lot more focused on rehabilitation so that they can move forward, because these same children are going to be adults one day. And if you don't stop it now, and if you don't give them the opportunity to move forward and past this, they're always going to be looking back, and they're always going to be in the system, essentially.
Do you think that juveniles should be placed on the sex offenders list?
Well, I think that is a very difficult question, and I think it's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. And the reason that I say that is because, at some point, juveniles who, a lot of times juveniles who have been sexually abused themselves end up being the offender at some point later on down the line. And I think that a lot of them, can certainly be helped. I mean, with psychological evaluations and counseling and different things, they can be helped. But I think that also they can be, they can be very dangerous, just like any other crime. They can be very dangerous. And so I think that the severity of the crime should certainly play a role in that. I think what you can certainly do is sometimes put a cap on the certain number of years that they're on this list, or if they show to be rehabilitated by, a counselor or whatever program they're in, that they, that those are considerations that you take into effect with possibly expunging them or, removing them from the list after a certain amount of time so it doesn't follow them forever.
Well, a CSC 4, a Romeo and Juliet crime,
right,
can be expunged.
Right.
But CSC 3, 2, and 1, where there's a rape or other inappropriate act can't be expunged. So I understand what you're saying about degrees. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about your practice and where you're going.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. Know your rights. Watch Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law, Tuesdays at 5 p.m. here on WHPR, Detroit Live. To start the rehabilitation process from the very first meeting with your client and his parent.
You know, absolutely. Issues that a lot of times need to be addressed, that can't be seen just from the actual crime itself. And so I think a lot of that, a lot of times, referring them to counseling. A lot of times family counseling. A lot of these children have anger issues about sometimes the lack of parenting, or the parent may have a drug problem, or the parent is absent, or whatever the case may be. And so those things really help kids to really sort these issues out. And I think going into the criminal process, once they're in the system, I think that it helps them to move forward and move beyond it, and hopefully address the issue that caused the behavior in the first place. And so I certainly always recommend that children, if they, and their parents, participate in family counseling, and also try to get involved in some other programs in the community, because I think that really helps them to channel some of the energy and issues that they have going on.
And would you agree with me, when you have to take a juvenile in front of a court, that if there's some involvement with the family and the juvenile interacting and doing some positive activities for the benefit of the juvenile and the family, or interacting and doing something in terms of community service, that the court's going to look at the juvenile differently in terms of sentencing?
Absolutely, because I think what it shows the court is that I know that I made a mistake. I'm willing to own up to that, but I also want to be able to move forward, and I also want different options and resources for my life, because this is important to me. And I think it shows a lack of maturity to some degree with the court, because it shows that you are owning up to that, and you're not just, just kind of hanging around waiting to see what the court is going to do. You're taking an active role in your own rehabilitation. And I think when judges see that, they're much more likely to to sentence you according to that.
Now, in your practice, I know you do a lot of juvenile work, so you can tell folks how to get a hold of you.
Absolutely. You can reach me at area code 313-218-4465. And that is a number that you can always reach me on, day or night, no matter what time it is. You can always call that number.
Do you represent adults as well as juveniles in criminal matters?
I absolutely do.
And I saw that you also do some driver's work.
I also do driver's license restoration, as well as child protective services expungement hearings, which a lot of my clients need that type of work also, because many people may not know that a CPS finding against you follows you like a criminal record.
Well, explain a little bit about child protective expungement proceedings.
Well, what happens is anytime you're involved with Child Protective Services, what happens is they assess your case and they determine whether or not you are a high or moderate risk, or sometimes even a low risk of offending again, and maybe in situations of physical abuse against the child. Or sexual abuse, or those types of things. Depending on the category that you are in, according to their finding, you will be placed on the central registry, which is essentially a registry that you will be on for a period of time, depending on whether or not, depending on the category of whatever abuse they found that you've committed. The problem with that is that anything in the healthcare world, when they run background checks, anything to do with kids, they run these checks and it'll come up just like a criminal record. And so if you don't move to expunge them, they can have a serious consequence on your life.
Now, do the expungement rules that I'm familiar with for criminals apply the same way with child protective?
No, the standards are different, and a lot of times you have to have a hearing if the department is unwilling to expunge it just as a request. Clients can certainly request it on their own, but a lot of times the department, once they review it, if they don't agree with you, then you have to set a hearing to have an independent administrative law judge hear the case.
Is there a waiting period for child protective service expungement proceedings?
There is not a waiting period. You have 240 days from the date that you were notified that you were placed on this registry to send in a request for your name to be removed. So there isn't a waiting period, but there is, after that 240 days, you can be precluded from sending in that request.
Am I only placed on that list if I have a conviction?
Well, the way it works with CPS is there necessarily isn't a criminal case where you've been convicted of anything. It's based on their policies and rules, whether they find that more likely than not that you committed whatever act was reported, whether it could be somebody reporting that you physically abused your child or sexually abused. So it doesn't always have to be in conjunction with a criminal case. Sometimes it is if it's severe enough, but a lot of times it's not. It has nothing to do with an actual conviction for that same thing.
Can neglect qualify?
Yes.
So if I leave my child and wander off and my child gets injured and I get charged with neglect, I can be placed on the list.
Absolutely.
And if I go out and look for a job, can my prospective employer go to that list and get background information?
Absolutely, they can.
If I called you on the telephone to find out if I was on that list, is there a way that you could check the list to see if I was on it?
I cannot. It is it is confidential, so you would have to contact the Department of Children and Family Services to get that actual information. But if you are on the list, they are supposed to send you notification, certified mail. So they try to ensure that you get that information notifying you that you are on that list.
Now, as a lawyer, could you get an authorization from a person to investigate and determine whether they're on the list under the Freedom of Information Act?
Absolutely.
Do you think it's important for people to know who've had problems in the past and encounters with the juvenile system to see if they're on that list?
Oh, absolutely, because it can absolutely affect your everyday life. Just going chaperoning a field trip for your kids. You may not be able to do that, depending on that particular school. If they run your background and that comes back, you cannot chaperone that kid's trip. So little things like that make a big difference. But also, if you're in the healthcare field, just certain areas you certainly cannot work if you are on this list.
What are your fees for expungement in this area?
They generally range from $750 to $1250.
And during the course of the last year, how many people have you represented in this area?
Expungements for
Yes.
CPS, about five or six. I don't see it a ton, but it's certainly there.
So if somebody wanted to contact you and get your assistance to make sure that they're clear if they're out looking for a job, how do they reach you?
My telephone number is area code 313-218-4465. There's always a free consultation, so you won't be charged for just talking, and you can certainly go from there. But I think it's certainly worth at least looking into, because it can be a big deal. It can follow you forever, just like a criminal record.
Well, Carmen, I want to thank you for showing up today.
Thank you for having me. I certainly appreciate it.
And you really enlightened me in juvenile law. We're happy to have you. We want you to come back.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Thanks again.
Thank you.